Alright, so we're back, of course, talking about some Final Fantasy VII, and I suppose also Remake for this discussion, and we are talking about the Promised Land, which is a subject I don't think we've ever touched on that much on this channel, if at all. When I searched it up on the channel, we only had like one video. It's like a translation Audrey did back in like June 2020, so it's been quite a while, damn near 2 years at this point. Now, this video is coming from some translations I've seen on Twitter from like Turquoise Hammer and Odysseus. I don't know, and maybe some other people. I'm not sure how many people are doing these translations for the Ultimania Omega. We're going to get into those here in a minute. But when it came to the topic of the Promised Land, at least back in the day when I was a young kid playing the original Final Fantasy VII, I definitely thought it was a real location. And back then, I have no internet access. I don't have a walkthrough guide or anything for Final Fantasy VII. I'm just playing the game at a very young age. I definitely scoured the planet of Gaia quite a bit, hoping to find this secret location that would be the Promised Land, which, of course, does not exist. At least in the original Final Fantasy VII. Now, the very common theory that's been out there for quite some time at this point that I probably lean more towards these days as an adult is that the Promised Land is just the Lifestream, because it's supposed to be this place that the ancients were looking for that would bring them supreme happiness, and obviously getting to exist within the Lifestream theoretically forever with your loved ones would be supreme happiness, obviously. But of course, there are people out there that think or want it to be a real location. Kind of like me, I'm kind of 50-50 on it. Whether they want to leave it ambiguous, confirm that it is Lifestream or make it a real location, I don't really care either way. And there's also characters within the story for Final Fantasy VII that are kind of the same as well. Like, you have Hojo, who thinks it's more or less like a theory or a hypothetical or some shit. Then you have people like Rufus, who think it's the North Crater, which one of the translations we're going to look at kind of confirms that it may or may not be the North Crater, just because there's an abundance of Mako there. Now, initially going into this video, we were going to look at one translation that involved Nomura from Final Fantasy VII Dismantled, which is a book that came out in 1997, so fresh off the release of the original FF7, in under a year, obviously. And we're going to look at that, and then we're just going to kind of discuss and talk about the Promised Land. But it turns out within the last few days, they also did a different translation from the Ultimania Omega that also involved the Promised Land that gave us some pretty interesting information that I thought we'd talk about as well. So right here we have the full page translation of Tetsuya Nomura's interview with FF7 Dismantled. We don't need to read most of it as usual. A lot of it's stuff that you kind of already know if you know Tetsuya Nomura, Final Fantasy VII. Though Nomura does confirm, at least back then in 97, of course, that Ifrit and Titan were his favorite summons, but he also mentions Knights of the Round. I wonder if that still stands today. And actually, another interesting piece, Nomura talks about how initially there was only Aerith, there was no Tifa, which is something we've known for a long time, that Tifa came in later on in development. But he actually talks about the death of Aerith in such a weird way, where he says that he was on the phone with Kitase on like a random Sunday night and just like suggested, hey, let's kill Aerith and bring in Tifa. Which I thought was kind of funny how casually he just kind of brings that up in this conversation or this interview that, just kind of a suggestion one night during a phone call. Like, hey, let's just kill off our main female protagonist right now, our main female heroine. Anyways, right here we have the first section where the Promised Land is discussed, and it says, you mentioned that you were involved in other aspects of the project aside from character design. And Nomura replies with, I also came up with the basic premise of the story, stuff like who everyone is and what they're trying to accomplish. I tried to think about the story context, such as Cloud being an ex-soldier who chases after Sephiroth, and parallel with the character design. Those two plot elements, Cloud's objective and the journey to find the Promised Land, served as the starting point for the entire story. So I thought that part was pretty interesting, since we're doing a Promised Land related video, of course, that the idea of the journey to the Promised Land or characters trying to find the Promised Land has always been an aspect of the Final Fantasy VII story, even from the very beginning. So this next part right here is Nomura giving his thoughts on what he thinks the Promised Land is, which is obviously kind of a big deal. He's one of the main devs for Final Fantasy VII. And the interviewer says, unlike with previous Final Fantasy games, it seems like the interpretation of this game's ending varies from person to person. Nomura replies with, that's something we had in mind as we made it. Some people might think that the Northern Cave is the Promised Land, while others might say that any place rooted in the earth is the Promised Land. Personally, I'm of the opinion that Midgar is the Promised Land, based on the fact that it's full of vegetation at the end, and it's a place where Aerith, an ancient, directs all that Lifestream. But I don't know how Nojima, the lead scenario writer, would respond to that. So that quote from Nomura right there is huge for a lot of reasons. For one, again, he's one of the main devs for Square Enix, especially these days, but back then on the original Final Fantasy VII, again, he's a character designer, but also came up with a lot of the shit for the story of OG FF7. But also the fact that, at least for Nomura, the Promised Land is an actual physical location in the world of Gaia. It's not just the Lifestream. I think that's kind of a big deal. Now, that doesn't mean that the Promised Land is in fact a physical location, but it's just that one of the main devs thinks that, and this was also back in 97. This is when there's only the original Final Fantasy VII. We didn't have the compilation like we have now, and everybody's ideas for what was happening with the Final Fantasy VII story back then could be very, very different now that we have so much other things within FF7. But even still, I think there is a bit of merit to the idea of the area where Midgar's at being the Promised Land, and not just because of the ending of Final Fantasy VII and, Aerith directing a shit ton of Lifestream over to that area to protect the world from Meteor, but think of what Midgar itself is. Think of, the reactors all around Midgar. Think of all the people that live inside Midgar, and how much Mako is needed to run that city every single day. There's got to be a shit ton of Mako below Midgar, And the Promised Land is supposed to be this place that has an infinite, or at least an abundance of Mako. So I do think it's an interesting idea. It's something I never even considered. Never even thought about the possibility that, the Midgar area would even be the Promised Land, but it could make a little bit of sense. But also North Crater, I think makes a lot of sense too, because there's a shit ton of Mako there as well. But also the way Nomura describes it with that quote is that the Promised Land could be Midgar because that's where Aerith threw all the Lifestream, but also because it's covered in vegetation, 500 years in the future. So maybe it sort of became the Promised Land, but also, 500 years in the future, when we get that cutscene, like, there's no humans left. We get confirmation that, like, every fucking person's dead then. So it could be the Promised Land, but there would kind of be no point. Unless Red 13 hangs out there a little bit, I guess. I don't know. I guess also Vincent is alive, though, too, because he is immortal, and him and Red 13 are supposed to meet up for, like, every single year, so the Red 13's not lonely. So Vincent, I guess, could vibe and hang out in overgrown Midgar as well. So I guess it's not entirely pointless, but still. Like, having the Promised Land be Midgar, even though there's no people left, like, the Promised Land was a people thing, it was an ancient thing. People were looking for it, so I don't know. Anyways, so right here we have the page that we're going to look at, but of course we're specifically going to be looking at the Promised Land section. We're just going to read the whole thing really quickly, and then talk about it. The Ancients' Connection, the Promised Land, a land where supreme happiness is said to lie, in which the Ancients reportedly strove to reach. A story passed down through ancient legends. No historical records exist that tell us precisely where it's located, what kind of land it is, or what supreme happiness refers to. Shinra interprets the Promised Land as a region abundant with Mako and plans to force an Ancient to find it for them. For Sephiroth, who seeks to be reborn as God, the Promised Land is a place that will serve as a power source for using the Black Materia. Though the two have different aims, it seems their interpretations of the Promised Land are not dissimilar, as they both consider the Northern Cave to be an ideal location. A certain theory held by planetologists posits that supreme happiness is the peaceful slumber, i.e. death, that awaits the Ancients after they fulfilled their mission. According to this belief, the Promised Land may be the subterranean Lifestream to which all people one day return, or perhaps the Promised Land can be considered any place in the world, so long as that place returns to the Lifestream. However, nobody can definitely say whether either of these is correct. As such, the interpretation of these words is up to each person who hears them. And then down there at the little picture it says, for those who dream of a land where vast amounts of energy lie, the Northern Cave, a place erupting with Lifestream, would be the very definition of a Promised Land. So right there's the section I was talking about earlier in the video where the translation seems to confirm that it at least is potentially the Northern Cave, the Northern Crater, whatever you want to call it. I call it both of them for some reason. But they also point out that, Sephiroth believes it to be the Promised Land, and for him it's, all the Mako there that give him enough energy and power to use the Black Materia to summon Meteor, which he succeeds in doing, so he's kind of right if he believes that to be the Promised Land. I think it's the best way to look at it, it's open to interpretation. Some people within the world of Gaia might believe that the Promised Land is the Lifestream, it's eternal happiness once they join up with the planet. Some people might think it's an actual physical location in the world, whether that's Northern Cave, Midgar, somewhere else. One thing's for sure, though, when it comes to the story for Final Fantasy VII, and I guess also Remake, the Shinra Company kind of publicly talks about the Promised Land being this place that has an infinite amount of Mako, an abundance of Mako, never-ending resource. Which we, of course, know to not be the case. There's a finite amount of Mako within the planet. That's the entire premise, at least with the beginning parts of the FF7 story, is that we're trying to stop Shinra from killing the planet. So we at least know that aspect of the Promised Land, whether it is a real place or not, it's not an infinite amount of Mako. And ultimately, when it comes to the remake story, I don't know entirely what I want. If I want them to give us a definitive answer on the Promised Land, or just continually leave it up to interpretation, because it's been 25 years now, and we don't have a definitive answer. But again, the most accepted answer is that it probably is the Lifestream, and I think that's the best thing. Leave it ambiguous, leave it up to interpretation, both within people within the world of Gaia and the Final Fantasy VII story, but also the fans. But my dudes, that's going to be pretty much the video, so of course I want to pass it off to you guys. So when it comes to the subject of the Promised Land, you can talk about it with OG FF7, the entire compilation, just Remake going forward, etc., etc., whatever you want to talk about. Do you think it is a real location within the world of Gaia? Is it somewhere out there it's just never been found yet? Or is it just simply the Lifestream, or the afterlife, so to speak? My dudes, that's the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, give a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you guys aren't interested in more Final Fantasy VII Remake content. Turn on notifications. Follow me on Twitter, @DavidYT. I'm a Discord. Links to the networks are in the description and in the outro. Later, guys.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Logain, or leave it like Cobain.